Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. My name is Carey Nieuwhof, and my goal is to help you lead like never before. So what I do every week is I sit down with world-class leaders and church leaders, business leaders, and I talk to them about what made them who they are and try to have the conversation with them that you would have if you got to sit down for lunch with them or have dinner with them or really got to spend some time with them. So we go into the backstory and we explore what made them who they are and some of the principles they've learned along the way. So if you enjoy this episode, I would love for you to like it, to subscribe, and also to share it with your friends. And in the meantime, here's today's episode. Adam, what a thrill to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
The thrill is all mine, Carey. I'm delighted to be here, and I can't wait to see where this conversation takes us.
So I agree with Seth Godin that this is a book that you should buy 4 copies of, 1 for you and 3 to give away. So congratulations. I was joking with you that it was hard for me to get my regular work done because, normally you prep for an interview or whatever, but I could not put the book down. And best diagrams and charts of any book I've ever read. So really funny. You have a great sense of humor. You must have enjoyed writing it.
Thank you. I had a blast writing it. And the charts and diagrams, I had the privilege of collaborating with Matt Shirley, who is my favorite account on Instagram because every day he posts a hilarious chart. And I found myself sharing a bunch of them one day and I thought, you know what? That's what's missing from this book. I need some visual humor. And I reached out to him cold and he said, I'd love to work with you on this. And then the rest was history.
No, it was really good because there's some actual scientific charts and then there's some jokes, which is really funny. And cartoons. Like if people like me don't like to read books without pictures, now there's pictures. So thank you. Really well done. How do you select the subjects for your book? This is number 4. And there seems to be, I heard you say in your interview with J.J. Abrams, that there was no overarching thread. And now you're sort of, rethinking that, pardon the pun. But I'd love to know how you decided, like on originals, give and take, because it's all research based. So there's a lot of investment there.
Yeah, I don't think I had a very disciplined process when I started. I took questions that I was interested in. And for me, interest meant that I would go to bed at night thinking about them. I would make my friends and family members talk to me about some of the research because I was just so fascinated by some of the questions. And then I think I filtered a little bit from all the things I was interested in to what's important and also where do I have something different to say? And I think if you just take the Venn diagram of interesting, important, and novel, I think that's been my heuristic for deciding what I want to study and write about. And I didn't realize it until recently that there is a common thread across all my books, which is I am trying to prove, and I think the evidence now is overwhelming, that you don't have to choose between character and success.
Say more about that. That's fascinating to me.
I mean, I think it's something I've seen year after year with my students at Wharton. They'll say things like, one of the reasons I wrote Give and Take was I had students saying, well, I'm going to achieve as much success as I can and make as much money as possible so then I can give back. No, actually,
your soul's gone by that point. But
yeah, good luck with that, right? I don't know how you're going to sleep at night, but I know a lot of successful people who were givers from the start, and they weren't doing it with money. They were generous with their knowledge, with their time, with their connections in introducing people. And let's figure out how you can combine that virtue of generosity with your own ambitions. And I think that's been a lens that I've been excited about ever since, is to say, okay, there may be ways in which, in this case, I think again is very much about the virtue of humility.
Yeah.
And how a lot of people think you have to be confident to the point of arrogant or narcissistic in order to achieve great things. And my goal in this book is to get you to rethink that if you believe that. But Carey, I know you don't believe that. So you don't have to do any rethinking on that.
Well, we spent a lot of time talking about that. The link between, my theory for years has been that your character is actually the cap on your capacity, because you look at how many super smart, wicked smart people are out there, gifted, talented, and yet, they're 30 years into their field and they end up having some kind of moral collapse or whatever. And this isn't even in the church space. This could be in the business space, political space, and they're down in flames, and I think that's a noble calling. So
I think so too. And you put that so beautifully. I think I think that becomes more true as people advance more in their careers. Because, if you just want to be an individual superstar, it's possible that with the right combination of hard work, talent, and luck, you can achieve something yourself. But the more powerful you become, the more your success depends on making other people successful. And it's really hard to do that if you are a selfish taker or if you are a narcissistic leader. And I've really taken issue lately with this idea of separate spheres that so many people like to talk about. So people will, whether it's a CEO or a political candidate, people will say, hey, you know what? I don't care what they do in their personal life. I'm interested in their professional competence. And that's never made any sense to me, because I don't think that we walk into the office and suddenly become a completely different person. And sure enough, there was a study that came out recently showing that men who cheat on their wives are also more likely to cheat on their taxes, and they're more likely to cheat when it comes to their company's finances, right? That you don't get to say I have integrity at work, but I'm a terrible person at home.
Well, and that I'm so glad you went into the cultural dimensions of this, because I read the book with interest, had a hard time putting it down. And I'm like, this is really good on the individual level. But then the third part of your book, I think it was part 3, went into the whole cultural milieu, sort of the political debate. And you didn't really go into politics, but you talked about really contentious issues too. And that has been a dominant line that we've heard over the last particularly 10 years. It's like, well, I don't care who you sleep with, as long as you pass these laws, appoint these judges, as long as you lower my taxes, or you pad the bottom line and my stocks go up, then I'm cool with you. And you're saying that's a bust.
I think in the long run, if that's our philosophy, we're all going to lose, because we're not really thinking about the character and the competence of the people we elevate into positions of leadership. And I would venture a guess that those qualities are pretty important.
Well, and you're an organizational psychologist. You teach at Wharton. You've been the top-rated teacher there for years now. I think it's 7 years as we record this. I would love to know, because in the young leaders I talk to, there is this desire for ethical business. I'm having a dinner at my place in May with a guy who just did a business school at a university here in Canada. He established it. And, one of the things we talked about at dinner last time we were together was, hey, like, what are we going to do about ethical investing, et cetera, et cetera? What changes are you seeing in the next generation of business leaders? Do you see that like cutthroat 80s, like Wall Street greed, or what are you seeing?
No, I think my students are fed up with Gordon Gekko. Let's leave that guy in the movies a couple decades ago. I think it's interesting. I think part of this is because we've started to see the really something that we should have seen all along, because economists always talk about externalities, right? The negative externalities associated with unbridled sort of shareholder capitalism. And so if you talk to any one of my MBA students or undergrads at Wharton, one of the first things they'll bring up is the idea that we need to be about stakeholders, not shareholders, that you can't claim that people are the most important resource in your company, because people are your company. And that we need to think about, obviously, serving the people that we lead, that servant leadership is important, that we need to care about customers in our community. And I think that's great news. I think part of the reason that that's getting amplified, though, is not just generational. It's actually a silver lining of the series of recessions that we've had. There's some research by Emily Bianchi, which looks at what the state of the economy is when you start your career. So if you finish school and take your first job, are we in a boom or a bust?
Right.
And it turns out that leaders who started their careers during a recession actually pay their employees more generously, and they're less likely to cheat.
Fascinating.
Which I thought was so interesting. And Emily's argument is that when you start your career knowing how difficult it can be to get a job, that creates a sense of noblesse oblige, that this sense of responsibility as opposed to entitlement, then it's something you carry with you throughout your career. And I have to wonder if we're now going to see a generation of leaders, in part because of this awful pandemic we've had to live through, who do feel a greater sense of responsibility than their predecessors did.
Fascinating. We're 400 episodes into this show now. And one of the things I've noticed with entrepreneurs who have gone on to do really, really well, led very big companies, et cetera, so many of them have heartbreak stories growing up. poverty, being picked on, whatever it was. And they turn out to be the most generous people. You would think they would be stingy, but in fact, they're actually generous. That's fascinating. Okay, I'm tempted to talk about originals, but I really want to dive into this book because I think it's that meaty. It needs to occupy at least an hour, if not more. You open the book with this idea. A preacher, a prosecutor, and a politician and a scientist walk into your mind. Okay, so I'm kind of three of those almost, like a preacher and a prosecutor. I was more on the defense side in my brief time in law. And I was actually involved in politics. I'm apolitical now, but in my teen years and early 20s, I was almost that. So I'm almost like 3 strikes, I'm out. So
wait a minute, Carey. I knew you were a preacher. I knew you had a law background. Politics too. This is the trifecta.
It is. There you go. That was going to be my thing. I was going to be involved in politics, and then I got disillusioned quickly in my early 20s and kind of stepped back. And then when I got a call into ministry, I'm like apolitical. So it's sort of been where I am over the last 30 years. But fascinating. So what is wrong with our preachers, our politicians, and our prosecutors as far as a mindset for thinking again goes?
Well, I think you just hit the critical distinction, which is I don't want to say there's anything wrong with these professions, right? I think the danger is that these professions sometimes take over our minds and prevent us from thinking again. And I'm guilty of all of them, especially the prosecutor. Yeah. But let's walk through the 3.
Yeah. Tell us about preachers, because you do have tens of thousands of preachers listening to this. So it's like, speak to us, because this is what we do, right? We're schooled in the art of persuasion. And I've found that evangelism, which is something I'm very passionate about, has changed over the years. And I think you're onto something.
Oh, interesting. I'm very curious to hear how you reacted to this. So the original idea came from my colleague, Phil Tetlock, who observed that when we do a lot of our thinking and decision making, we kind of operate like we're preachers, prosecutors, and politicians. So when you're thinking like a preacher, you've got a set of sacred beliefs, and you think your job is to spread those and proselytize. And a prosecutor, I think, in some ways is the opposite. I'm trying to win an argument, and that means I have to make sure that you are wrong. And then a politician, I think, is fundamentally about trying to get the approval of a certain audience. And that might mean that I'm doing a lot of campaigning and lobbying and maybe flattering you, right, to try to curry favor somehow. And Carey, I think the danger of all of these is that they can stand in the way of rethinking, because if I'm a preacher or a prosecutor, I'm sure I'm right and you're wrong, and that means I will not change my mind. You might need to change yours, right? But I'm good. I've already found the truth.
That is the goal. Yep. I guess of a preacher, that's how a lot of us think. Yep.
And then as a politician, the worry is that I'm not pursuing the truth if I change my mind. I'm just doing it to fit into my tribe.
Right.
And so I'm not actually pursuing, a higher principle of integrity to find out what might be real, or what might be right. So let's start with the preacher, because you are a preacher by calling. Where do you come down on this? Do you also worry? I think let me just say one other thing, sorry, that I should have said earlier, which is I can see the value of talking like a preacher in order to inspire people.
Yeah.
Where I get worried is when people are always thinking like preachers and, sort of taking everything as a matter of faith as opposed to holding some doubt. So help me make sense of that.
Well, you make a really, really good point. I mean, I think there's always, I would say as I've gotten older, I've become more open-minded, which is probably going to generate a lot of letters and angry things. It's like, wait a minute, you're supposed to be more convinced, et cetera, et cetera. But here's what I've discovered. Now, I'm Canadian, so I live north of Toronto. I would say that we are more post-Christian than a lot of American culture. Depending the coast, go to California, Seattle, it's pretty post-Christian. But, middle America, you're pretty much in the Bible Belt still, at least if you're dealing with baby boomers and older Gen Xers. I would say, and I'd love to, because I think you make a really good point that everybody needs to pay attention to, because to some extent, your book is about the art of persuasion in the context of rethinking. You talk a lot about that. And what I've found is there's always a minority group that is attracted to certainty in black and white. In other words, you're always going to find those people, right? You can find them on the internet, find them in the church. And there are churches built on like, I have a monopoly on the truth, blah, 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 blah. So here's what I've discovered. half of the people who attend our church, and I've handed it off to the next generation now a few years ago, but half the people who attend our church didn't used to attend church. And that kind of certainty is actually repulsive to them. That what they have discovered, what I discover is that when I give intelligence to an atheist argument or to an agnostic argument, it actually gains me credibility. You talk about it in here, but steel man versus straw man. So it's pretty easy to set up the straw man or straw woman and knock them down. But if I take the best argument of my opponent and actually honor it and say, you know what, that's a really good point. That is a really good point. And intelligent people think a very different way. However, have you considered X? I've learned as a preacher but that's kind of where you go in your book. But that whole idea of, Adam, let me give you 15 reasons you're wrong, right? Like that's a bit dated.
It is. I love the way you just articulated that, because I think what you're doing at a fundamental level is you are establishing that although your job is, in that circumstance to be a preacher, that you're willing to think more scientifically. Okay. That you're interested in exploring different ideas, right? As opposed to just sort of selling your answers.
Well, and I think that's true. I mean, I think atheists have a lot of good points. I think agnostics have a lot of good points, I don't know, right? There's a lot we don't know. There are a few things about Christianity for myself that I'm like, I just can't walk away from that. Like I'm having a really hard time. Maybe you can help me, but I just can't walk away from some of the core things. And I find that kind of, and the other thing, I've taught this for years to preachers, but it's assume intelligence, not background. And often a lot of the time, if you listen to preaching, and I don't know how much preaching you've been exposed to in your life, certainly the stereotypes, but a lot of preaching assumes that you're stupid and I'm smart. And I think if anybody was to treat me that way, I would be offended. I'd just love for you to comment on it, because you do have a lot of preachers listening right now.
Yeah. It's funny. I've made the same mistake as a teacher, right? Where I've thought, okay, my job, as a psychologist by training, my job is to understand the mind and behavior and apply it to leadership in organizations. And I thought when I started my career that I was here to enlighten my students, essentially, about
they're dumb, you're smart, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Although I think I would have said I have a lot of knowledge that they don't.
Correct.
And that knowledge, is grounded in rigorous evidence, and I want to make sure that they have access to it. And over time, I started to get very disillusioned with myself because I was failing to practice what I teach. I was basically treating evidence as gospel, as opposed to saying, you know what? I brought you the best randomized controlled experiment on effective leadership that I could, but it was done with one group of people in one country, in one industry. And you're right, we don't know how that would play out in a different setting. And why don't we try to figure that out? What an exciting opportunity for all of us to learn. And I think that's been just a big aha for me, is that one, I learn a lot more with that orientation. And two, I think that people are much more excited to learn with you than they are to learn from you.
Ooh, that's good. That's really, really good. So that's why people love, that's one of the reasons people love your show, Carey, is you enter into these conversations where you're in discovery mode and curiosity mode, not just preaching mode, right? I tell you, I formulate these questions really carefully, and I try to be open. I try to be really, really open. And I have guests who don't agree with each other on the show. I don't have them on the same episode, but it's like, there's some room. So you would say you were the prosecutor. You were the person who was what does a prosecutor do?
I was the worst prosecutor, and I still am more often than I would like to admit. I'm that person who, one of my all-time favorite cartoons is it's a guy sitting at a computer. He can't sleep, and the question is why, and he says, someone is wrong on the internet. It's the story of my life. When I think somebody's beliefs are incorrect, I feel like it's my job to try to educate them. And I think that's why I was drawn to being a social scientist. It's why I was excited about becoming a professor, in part because I wanted to help people move closer to the truth. And I think the way that I did that, you touched on it earlier, I would pile on reason after reason and argument after argument. And one day, one of my students actually called me a logic bully, which I didn't know what to make of that at first. And sheepishly, I was a little bit proud because I don't want to bully anyone, right? But I want to use the most compelling logic and the most airtight evidence to try to convince people to change their minds on things. And so I thought it was a little bit of a kind of a funny compliment. And then she said, but no, because I don't agree with your arguments. I just don't feel I can fight back.
Wow. So it's like intimidating, right? Or
yeah,
what would you say?
Yeah, exactly. I think she just sort of felt stifled. And she felt like she wanted to explore. She was trying to make a big career decision. And I thought she was missing out on a perspective that I knew from our past interactions was not comfortable for her. Like she thought she needed to accumulate degree after degree after degree to get successful. And when she had this mission that she had to come back to business school for an MBA after she'd already done an undergrad business degree, it's like nobody really needs 6 years of business education. And I have this horrible instinct, Carey, when somebody's passionate about one direction and I think they might have a blind spot, to argue the polar opposite as passionately as I can, even though I didn't really believe it. But that was my logic bully mode, telling her all the reasons that business school is a waste of time and money. Ironic coming from a business school professor, right? And I think what happened was I was taking her ownership away from her decision. I was preventing her from really thinking the options through in an open-minded way by sort of trying to hammer a bunch of counter arguments at her. And I came away from that thinking, I don't want to be that person. And so now what I do in those interactions is I start by asking, why are you here? Do you just want my stamp of approval on a decision you've already made? Because I'm happy to give that. I'm not going to judge you. I want you to pursue whatever happiness and success means to you.
Right.
Are you here for me to point out holes in your thinking potentially? I'm happy to help you do that. Do you want me to stress test your decision-making process and, really go into challenge mode? And I could certainly do that. And I never have regretted having that upfront discussion.
Wow. Yeah, some of the ways I've thought about that is sometimes you give a $5 answer to a 5-cent question. It's like, right?
It's so true. Yes.
It's just like, should we go to Wharton or like, are you thinking about Stanford? And you give them the big essay on 17 reasons why business school isn't for you or whatever, right? And so that's a prosecutor mode. And then politician, anything else to say on politician? You're kind of currying favor, trying to win votes, trying to win the argument.
Yeah, I think a politician mindset is leading us to tell people what we think they want to hear, but not necessarily to change what we really believe. And so it's it's kind of it's putting on an act or a show to try to impress or manipulate an audience. But I'm gonna really stick to what I always thought was true here.
And then thinking like a scientist. I know that is the metaphor that carries through the whole book, but like just in a nutshell, what does it mean to think like a scientist instead?
So I don't mean it in the formal sense, right? Because I think a lot of people hear scientists, like, I don't have a lab coat. I don't know how to use a microscope or a telescope. What? But when I think about the values of being a scientist, I was trained at least to be humble and curious. And that means I have to know what I don't know. I have to doubt a lot of my convictions and treat a bunch of my opinions or beliefs as just hypotheses, and then be open to testing them. And I think, this is actually something I've been rethinking since Think Again came out, is I could have easily said, think like a scholar as opposed to a scientist, because I don't think you have to use the scientific method. I think what I like about the idea of being a scientist is you're open to running experiments and you're actually excited to discover that you might have been wrong, because that means you've learned something and you're getting a little bit closer to the truth. And I think that's what a scholar does, right? I think that's what a religious scholar does. I think that's what you do when you lead Bible study or when you encourage people to reflect on scripture, is you're encouraging people to revisit ideas and assumptions that they might have been closed-minded on, or that they might not have thought about as applying to their life in ways that are very relevant right now. And so I think that it's interesting to me that part of what I mean by thinking like a scientist is actually what a good preacher would do.
Okay, say more about that, because I do I do want to ask some deconstructionist questions. Like, oh, do you just think again until there's nothing left, right? You've seen through it all. But let's talk. I love that thought. What about what a good preacher would do? How would that preacher do it?
Well, I don't know, right? So I mean, that's the first thing I should disclose. I keep an ignorance list of all the things I'm just completely clueless on, and it's ever growing. And it's just a reminder to me to not, try to sound articulate on things that I really don't have experience or expertise in. But two, also it's a prompt for me to go and get curious about the things I don't know. So that was part of why I was excited to have this conversation. Is here's a chance to learn from you what an alternative to, the kind of preaching that I talked about and Think Again looks like. So I would love to learn from you. What do you think an effective preacher does?
Well, this is fascinating. Okay. So even back in seminary, let me go back into your prosecutor mode. And I don't want to flip the mic entirely. Okay. But let's go back into, so my 1 year in law, which was not very long. And I was like junior on the totem pole. I was a student actually, but they threw me in court every day. And so pretty much 4 or 5 days a week I was in court, and I only lost twice. And I learned how to win in that little tiny experiment of a run. But the way to win was I had to not only think about my client's position, I had to think about the judge. What does a judge need to know to rule in my favor? And I've got to present that evidence. And if you were my opponent in court, quote, opponent, I had to know what you were going to say. So I had to go through my mind and figure out, okay, Adam is going to say this, and he's going to claim this, and he's going to pull out this case law, but then the judge, in order to rule in my favor, needs X. And so if I can say these things, which are true, you're bound by truth, then we're probably going to come out on top. And so it mostly worked, which was great. And I've taken that approach into preaching. It's like, if you're coming to our church for the first time, Adam, and you're skeptical, you're like, you know what? I actually went to school. I don't believe this stuff. I'm not sure Jesus rose from the dead. The Bible's an ancient book. It's like, what are you thinking? I speak to that. And often my favorite thing when I'm preaching a message is to think about the element of surprise. Because one of the things that happens is we think we know the text, right? We think we know, oh, Jesus teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, or, we heard it a million times. Particularly if, like me, you grew up in church, you're like, yeah, I can rhyme it off. There's always surprise in the text. And so one of my jobs as a communicator is to say, well, why did that man who was very well regarded in the community fall down at the feet of Jesus? Like, do you know what that was culturally? That was like, nobody would do that. Like, nobody would do that. That would be like the president of the United States breaking security detail and walking into a homeless shelter and sitting down in disguise and having a meal. It would be
you know what, Carey? I have to say that is an episode of Undercover Boss that I would watch in a heartbeat.
Cool. Okay.
I love that idea. Go on.
Yeah, but isn't that still, it's surprise. It's like, and if the text isn't surprising me, and it should, because I believe it's the word of God, then, wow, here we are. So exegete that a little bit. Like, what is good about that? What is not? Sorry, that's a theological term, exegete. Like, but do you use that
I'm
in
all for
business
exegesis.
School?
Absolutely.
Yeah, exegesis,
and exegesis is like an academic soliloquy.
Yes, exactly. So tell, like, break that down a little bit. What do you think? What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think you're actually doing exactly what I've been trying to learn to do, right? Which is to describe something unexpected and then be curious about what is the reaction that provokes. And so this is very meta, but I'm going to try to answer your question as opposed to just being intrigued by the modeling that you just did of what I've been studying. So I think it's really compelling to me at a basic level. The one caveat to that is I don't think I would have wanted to oppose you in a courtroom. I think it would have been a real challenge, an uphill battle, and I also think I would have liked you less than I like you right now.
Oh, we go for lunch after. It's fine.
Oh, good. Okay, I feel better now. No, but I think the element of surprise is exactly what's missing from so many conversations between people who disagree, both of whom will complain that the other person is being stubborn and closed-minded.
Right.
And it's one of the things I love most about my life as an organizational psychologist is I get to do and read all these studies that contradict my expectations. And then there's a part of me that wants to downplay that surprise because how long have we been studying leadership in teams? We should have a pretty good set of predictions by now. And then there's another part of me that says, well, meteorologists have been doing this a long time and they have much more precise measurements and they can't even tell me what the weather's going to be tomorrow. So human beings are even more complex than cloud systems. So I think amplifying that surprise and saying, well, before we tell you what the data showed, what would you expect to play out here? It's one of my favorite things to do in the classroom with students. Right. It's one of my favorite things to experience as a reader or as a listener or an audience member. And I think my reaction to it is, I think you just gave a poignant description of why we all need to be open to thinking again. Not about everything, which we'll talk about.
Yeah.
Your idea that there might be a surprise in the text, right? That is an invitation to rethink material that you already believe you've understood and look at it through a new lens. And
there you go.
Why else would you keep rereading the same material over and over again if you weren't going to learn something new from it?
Yeah, you're right. I would make the argument that if you're only hearing what you think you're going to hear, you're not actually reading the text properly when it comes to sacred text, that you're missing the point, because if it's still not speaking to you, you're probably not reading it openly enough or curiously enough. And if God isn't surprising you, I don't know whether you're worshiping God, and I don't mean that in a heretical way. I just mean it as in a fresh way. One of the other seminary moves I learned back in the 90s at U of T was, I think it was David Buttrick talked about contrapuntals. So apparently it's a football move. I'm not a sports guy, but it's a football move. But the idea is what I took away from it was you anticipate the objection. It's a little bit like law. So if you're sitting there in my congregation on Sunday morning, I'm like, Adam, and I don't know your personal background, but let's say you were skeptical, agnostic, atheist, whatever. I'd be like, what does Adam bring to this text? Oh, I know what he's going to object about. He's going to say, well, I don't actually think Jesus rose from the dead. That's like folklore. Or I don't actually believe that what you are presenting on the screen is what was written by Mark or Matthew 2,000 years ago, that there's been all kinds of error and that kind of thing. And so then that's called a contrapuntal. You go and you kind of bring that up and say, well, some of you are probably thinking I don't even know whether I can trust the Bible, or I don't even know whether Jesus rose from the dead. And I can't solve that for you in 5 minutes, but let me give you a couple of thoughts around that issue. Boom, boom, boom. And then because then what I've done is I've dislodged an objection that you would have spent the rest of the message thinking about. And now you can say, okay, well, I don't think he convinced me, but I can at least follow the argument for another 20 minutes or so.
Yes.
Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think that's so effective. It's something I've watched entrepreneurs do. My favorite example you might remember from Originals is Rufus Griscom, who pitched his startup by saying, here are the 3 reasons you should not invest in it.
Yes.
And by anticipating investors' objections, he showed that he was he wasn't drinking the Kool-Aid. He actually was thinking critically. He also made it clear that he must be pretty confident in the strengths of his startup if he was willing to admit all the weaknesses.
Yeah.
And he made it harder for the investors to think of their own objections. And the harder they had to work to find the flaws in his argument, the less flawed they thought his argument was. And I think you've just done a version of that. What I think is also kind of, well, this is surprising about it to me, is it makes me think a little bit about the difference between what you know and what you believe. So I would say my stance is open, right? I'm not committed to a particular religious doctrine because I don't know.
Right.
But I'm very I can't imagine how this universe could exist without some force that we don't understand.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's something I could see believing in. And I would be much more receptive to you saying, you know what? How do I know that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, I actually can't know that, right? I can't put you in a time machine and show you that it happened. But here's why I've chosen to believe it. I'm like, oh, all right, I could get behind that. Is that the kind of direction that you were taught to go? Or is that taking it too far for you?
That's a great question. I don't know that I was taught that. I think I learned that. I I think I learned that over time. I learned it through trial and error. I've been at it for 25, 30 years now, between courtrooms and, pulpits and writing. And I think that is an element of, there was a certainty to dialogue 3 decades ago that has vaporized in the last few years. And now with the explosion of the internet, which I hope we'll get to, and everybody having an opinion, everybody being able to air it, I think it requires a different kind of apologetics where, apologetics, literally apologia means defense, right? And when you come across as defensive, I would rather come across as open. I would rather come across as, I've got questions about the text too. So let me show you what has helped me come to this conclusion rather than, here's what you better believe. We got 13 minutes left on this message. So,
You are talking like a scientist and preaching to my choir in doing so. if that makes any sense. That resonates. And it makes me think of something else that I'm very curious to get your reaction to just while we're on this general theme. A friend told me the other day that she learned that the definition of repent is not what she thought it was.
Wow.
When I heard repent, I pictured someone saying, I'm a sinner, I'm guilty, maybe even I feel ashamed. And she said the original meaning of repent is actually to rethink, to reconsider your past actions and maybe chart a different course moving forward. And I wondered if you could either challenge that or elaborate on it.
She's much closer than I feel terrible and I'm ashamed and, here I come begging for mercy. My understanding, and we can do this when we're off the air, I'll pull out the Greek dictionary, is that it means to turn. That it literally means I was going to attack you, but now I'm going to step back. Now I'm not going to do it. So it means a change. So it doesn't necessarily accompany. So I think her definition, like to rethink your position, to go, oh, I could be wrong. Yeah, I would say that's probably within, because usually what happens when you look at the original Greek, there's a range of meanings. So she could be very, very accurate on that. Yeah. It certainly doesn't mean grovel, cry, sniffle, and maybe on a good day I'll forgive you. Like that's not what it means.
Well, right there, right? That immediately makes the idea of repenting much more appealing to all your skeptics, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah. And it's so funny because you walk in with all this baggage, right? Some of which, because you probably heard repentance preached exactly according to the stereotype that you would, but often, and that's the element of surprise. Like the first time I realized that is not what repentance means, I'm like, oh, well, that's interesting. Because with my personality, I don't always feel remorse. Like, I should, but maybe I don't. And then other people, they struggle with guilt so badly that they think, I'm never going to get over this. Like, I'll never be good enough. I'll never be forgiven. And see?
Say more about that. What do you mean when you say your personality means you may not feel as much remorse as you should?
I don't know whether you know the Enneagram or not. It's a personality typing system. So I'm an 8. So what it means is I tend to be a bull in the china shop. And so often I will step on your feelings. And I have people in my life I've been with for years who, are on my team, on my staff, and they're 2s and they feel everything. So, I used to have people pull me out of the meeting. It's like, do you know you totally insulted him? And she was almost in tears at the end of it. And I'm like, what? I'm like, oh, sorry. I didn't even see it. And so I would be a little less sensitive and other people would feel that more. So that's what I would mean by that.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Do you know what you are on the Enneagram?
So I should say, full disclosure, I'm on the fence about the Enneagram because on the one hand, I think the categories are extremely informative for people. And you can immediately identify how you differ from other people using it. I think it hasn't kept up with modern developments in psychology and psychometrics. And so some of the items end up probably misclassifying people. And I'm not sure that we actually need all 9 categories. My colleague Brian Little just did a neat analysis where he showed that there might actually be 5 or 6 underlying them. But I think it's one of the most intuitively appealing frameworks I've ever seen. So is 8 protector?
It's a challenger, but it does have protective. Yeah, definitely. Like once you're in, I gotcha. Like, yeah,
got it. Yeah, I think every time I've taken it, I've been 2, 3, or 5, which I want to say are. I'm trying to remember. There's like supporter, advisor is one of them. One is achiever, and I forget.
And 5, my wife's a 5. So that is, Ian Cron calls that type the investigator. So this is somebody who's very research driven, kind of hidden, cryptic, all those things. Well, this is fascinating. We're going to have to get you to reinvent apologetics in and preaching for us for the 21st century.
I'm not sure I'm qualified to do that.
Yeah. But the framework's fascinating.
I like the reframing of it. Back to you. Okay.
So one of the questions I did have, and I think you get to it at the end of the book, and I know you believe this, like what happens if you have a core belief? Like, my faith is very central to who I am and what I built my life on. And yeah, I'm open to looking at this passage in a fresh way and, really surprised by this. But at the end of the day, I think, Jesus, I continue to be convinced he was risen from the dead. Can you get to the level of deconstructionism where you rethink everything so much that you no longer believe anything? Like, is there a line?
Yeah, I don't think I'd want anyone to be there because at that point you might just be a nihilist.
Yeah, exactly, right?
Doesn't sound like fun or a productive way to live. I think that we should. I guess I think about this as a spectrum, right? Where most people are probably too far to the left of the sweet spot of rethinking in their lives overall. And that means, they're too inclined to prefer the comfort of conviction over the discomfort of doubt. It means they're too interested in surrounding themselves with people who agree with their conclusions, as opposed to those who might challenge their thought process.
Right.
And so what I want to do is I don't think it's my place to tell anyone how much rethinking they should do, let alone what they should rethink. What I want to do is just encourage people to reflect on, am I doing enough rethinking? And Carey, the reason that I care so much about that is I think the vast majority of our regrets are situations where we did our rethinking in hindsight. And we said, I wish I had reconsidered whether this job was the right fit for me, or whether I should have left this toxic culture, or whether I should have been in a relationship with this person who, was clearly not aligned with my values. And I think if we did a little bit more of the rethinking up front, we could avoid some of those regrets.
That is so good. And yeah, I think there are core values. Like I tend to see from what I know of you publicly reading your books and listening to your podcast, like you would love the values of compassion and empathy. I would say those would be core. So you're not talking about like rethinking those over and over again.
No, I mean, if you could give me every single argument you can think of for why I should be a selfish jerk, and I'm probably not going to be that motivated to rethink it. I'll always look for another way to say, look, you can try to be kind and generous and achieve success. And the good news is I have a lot of evidence on different ways of doing that. So I've went and I feel like I pressure tested that set of values. But I think you just made an important distinction between beliefs and values that's worth double clicking on.
Okay.
I think that we should be quicker to rethink our beliefs than our values.
Can you
I think
explain
of
the
a
difference?
belief as something that you accept as true. I think of a value as a principle that you hold as important. And so when I think about my values, I'd say generosity, excellence, integrity, and freedom are maybe the top 4. Although I'm open to revisiting that, tinkering a little bit. But I want to stay as flexible as I can about the best ways to live those values. I might find out tomorrow that the way I was pursuing excellence, which makes me late for meetings all the time, is actually not a generous way to treat people. Actually, I found that out several times. I really need to work on it, right? But I want to be open to rethinking my habits and my beliefs about what daily behaviors and practices will best allow me to express those values and make them core to my life. And so to take this back to your original question, your faith is really interesting because you could position that as a belief or a value.
No, exactly.
Or both.
Yeah.
So what parts of that system of thinking for you are belief versus value?
Yeah, I'd really have to, again, double click on what you mean by that. But I think it's both. Like, foundational to me is the Word of God's the Word of God. Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus is God. And beyond that, it's like, I'm not one of those people who has a doctrinal statement that you need a dump truck to read, right? Here it is. I just delivered it to you. It's 17,000 pages. Enjoy it. I'm not one of those people. It's pretty, my faith is very orthodox in the sense that it's traditional. It tends to be what Christians have believed over the centuries as opposed to what some guy on the internet believed yesterday. So it's less propositional and more foundational to historic Christianity and hopefully first century Christianity. As far as my values go, yeah, there are things that are, I think beliefs are becoming clearer, and things I used to believe, I don't believe in the same way. And that's not, oh, I become more progressive or I become more whatever. It's just like, no, having wrestled with the text, I think the text is actually demanding of me things it didn't used to demand in terms of kindness and humility and patience. And, that this is a very different way. I have a Sunday prayer ritual where I go through some of what they call the fruits of the Holy Spirit. And I pray that they would be more manifest in my life: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, goodness, self-control, and a few others. So, those I'm revisiting on a regular basis. And then that's probably also feeding into my values. I don't know, I'd really have to think about that. But there are some core beliefs, like we mentioned it a few times, Jesus rose from the dead and, he is God, that I would be like, yeah, it would take a lot for you to dislodge that from the center of my life. So yeah, that's my take on that.
Yeah, and I wouldn't want to dislodge that, right? Because I can't disprove that.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's completely outside the realm of my capabilities as a social scientist. And I mean, the audacity also to tell you that I know what really happened.
Right.
Please, come on. This is your field, not mine. I think there's something interesting, maybe a hunch or a question that I want to explore a little bit here. And you may decide that this is not an interesting line of inquiry, but I'm curious about it. So I want to ask you about it. I want to run a little thought experiment and say, well, first of all, let me test one of my assumptions here. Jesus did not write the Bible, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
How many years later do we think it was captured?
Depending on who you read, the scholars, there's a range, but the Gospel of Mark may have been complete by 30 years after the resurrection, a little under 30 years after the resurrection of Jesus. So within decades, and it was carried through in oral tradition and fragment. But most people would say that the four Gospels in the New Testament was composed between 60-ish AD, some would put it in the 50s, through to 90. About 90, 91, 96. Revelation goes maybe to 96 AD. So within the first lifetime of Jesus.
Okay, great. That's helpful. So we're looking at some number of decades.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
So one of the things I think about with my psychologist hat on is a game of telephone. Okay. And how if you've ever told a story to somebody and then they tell it to someone else, there are pieces that get lost in translation. Yeah. And so let's just imagine for a moment that a little bit of that happened over the 30 or 60 years between Jesus's teachings and then the transcription of some of the core texts.
Okay.
And let's say that we discovered an earlier iteration that we can authenticate.
Right.
And it turns out that Jesus said, hate thy neighbor.
Right. Okay. For argument's sake.
And it's authenticated. It's a source closer to Jesus than the text you've been relying on your whole life. And I know this is such a weird thought experiment. My question is, would you rethink your stance on what you owe to your neighbor based on that?
Ooh, that went in a very different direction than I thought you were going to take it. Well done.
I think you probably have a sense of why I'm going there, but I want to I want to play it out for a second, and then we can figure out whether it makes any sense.
No, I'm not a person of hate. And, I would want to. Yes, I'm not a person of hate. I do not want that. I would want the other text to be true about Jesus. And we'd have a long discussion about the scholarship of that fragment, et cetera, and we'd have a really good look at it. But no, I would want to be a person of love. And one of the principles of Calvinism, I don't know whether it's Calvinism or not, but the clear interprets the unclear. Because you can find that Bible verse fragment and run a million miles in the wrong direction with it. But there are times where the Bible's evidently clear. The Bible's been very clear, Old Testament, New Testament, about love. So yeah, I would say no, I'm still committed to love. We'll have a conversation about the text.
That's amazing. Okay, so that hypothesis, I think, was supported.
Okay.
My hunch was that there are certain values you hold so dear that you would stick to them even in the face of some of your beliefs being challenged.
Yes. And I would say what's formed that as a foundation of my love, though, because this is a chicken and the egg thing. I grew up with Christian parents. That was something that I learned as a child. It's something I have believed for 55 years. And, all that stuff. And now I look at it and go, Jesus was about hate. We need to have a really serious conversation about that. And I need to really see the scholarship. But it's an interesting thought experiment. So I have one for you if we're going to play along. Okay. If church felt more like this, what do you think would happen?
I think that a lot of people who choose other careers would be drawn to the clergy in some way. I think is the first thing that comes to mind. I think the second thing is that a lot of people who are more agnostic or, not even agnostic, right, but just not deeply religious would be excited about church as not just a source of community, but actually a place to go to explore and learn. In other words, what school is supposed to be.
I'm going to get emotional. That's really cool to hear you say that. That's been a hope of mine, a prayer of mine for a long time. And I think, there's a lot of stereotypes that we're closed-minded. We're going to beat you over the head with our logic. And I want to get back into logic bullies, but I'm just going to breathe that in. Thank you. That was a gift. No,
please. I think, it's completely the opposite of what people who are not attached to a religious institution expect, right? When they think about entering that world. And I think it's a complete rethinking of the role of religion in American society at some level, right? Because at least if you take and obviously this is not your strand of Christianity, but if you think about the founding of America, right, this is a Protestant country. The Protestant work ethic still dominates our workplaces. The vast majority of CEOs come from a Protestant background. We tend to see hard work as a virtue inherently, regardless of what purpose you're working toward, and whether that's a worthy end or a noble cause.
Yes, sometimes it is, sometimes it's not.
Exactly, and so I think this is a really interesting and different way of imagining the role that religious teachings could play in people's lives, which is this is a place to explore important questions about the meaning of life. And I'm sure, this might be a little tangent, but you must have read Derek Thompson's Atlantic article, I think 2 years ago, on workism.
Oh, I read parts of it. Yeah, I remember. I couldn't quote it to you, but I am familiar with that. Yep.
The thing that really stuck with me about it was that, as religion has declined in American society, people have acted as if work could be a substitute, right? And that the meaning and the community and frankly the understanding that I expected to come from, really engaging with questions that are much larger than myself. I'm going to get that from my job, really? And it's no wonder that people are often miserable and depressed at work, because that is an unrealistic set of expectations.
Well, that would be okay, you've just tapped into a motherlode of an idea about what is replacing faith in America. Because I think you can make the same argument. I've heard Tim Keller, a preacher in New York City, make this argument that if you look at all the pressure on marriage today, children, the worship of children, the worship of spouses, the worship of work, the worship of ideas, ideology, politics. There's a vacuum right now in American life, and so many contenders, people are just reaching out for something. And I would want to say, to be fair, you have plenty of evidence, unfortunately, very recent evidence, that the church is full of closed-minded people who are not open to ideas. All you have to do is accidentally follow someone on Instagram, and you're in that. Which again, I really appreciate about your book, because you go there toward the end where you talk about the way we talk as a culture and the way we think as a culture. So, this is so fresh, man. I feel like we could have dinner and talk for a couple hours about just that one thing you raised about what is filling the void of religion in America.
That's a book waiting to be written. It's a whole podcast series in and of itself.
It is.
Wait, are you saying we're not having dinner right now? This feels
I know, it really does, doesn't it? Oh man, Adam. So you think work is what are the dangers? Like in that Workism article, just to give people, because we do have a lot of entrepreneurs listening as well. So, and I've, being a preacher, it's like, I'm probably not going to have drugs or alcohol as my vice, but like throw yourself into work, you get a raise and a promotion, right? So, why can't work, you're an organizational psychologist. Why can't work bear that load?
Well, I don't think organizations exist to give purpose to the people who work in them, right?
Bingo.
I think that's, sadly, I would love it if organizations did, and we do know mission-driven companies, but I don't think that's why most organizations are started. I think that's a challenge. I think it scares me anytime somebody calls a company a family. Like, really? Would your family fire you if you did a bad job for a couple of weeks? That's not a standard that we can match up to. Call it a community. What you're trying to say is, this is not just a transaction. This is a place where you can belong, but communities expel people when they violate their values. And I think that, that's another thing that is just a tough pill for a lot of people to swallow. I think another challenge is that when work fills this void in our lives, it's too easy for people to become compulsive workaholics. Where they feel guilty if they're not working. They put undue pressure and stress on themselves. And there are actually physiological health costs of that, right? We know that that you're at higher risk for heart attacks, for example, if you become a compulsive workaholic. Yeah. My colleague Nancy Rothbard has a nice alternative to this. She calls it being an engaged workaholic. Where you still may work a lot. And I think, Carey, you might be one of these people. But you work a lot because you're passionate about it. You enjoy the work, and you also think it's making the world a better place. And it turns out that there are no documented health costs of that kind of workaholism, as long as it's a choice, as opposed to just an obligation.
Yeah, this is kind of my retirement. Like this is what I hope to do for the next few decades. And it is fun 9 mornings out of 10 when I get up and get to have conversations like this. And it's funny. I heard someone say meaning isn't something you get from your work. It's what you bring to your work. And does that make sense as an organizational psychologist?
It does. It tracks with what my colleague Amy Resnesky has studied for years, which is that meaning isn't really something that you seek. It's more something that you make or create. And she's found, you read about this and Think Again, she and Jane Dutton did these wonderful studies of job crafters, people who take these job descriptions that were made for somebody else or some faceless group of people and say, well, this doesn't capture all of my passions and values and strengths. Let me become an architect of my own job and customize it so that I can make it a little bit more me and bring more of myself to this work.
Okay. Well, we got to get into some of the ideas and Think Again, because we barely scratched the surface, but this has been absolutely riveting, Adam. And thanks for going there. Thank
you. I'm enjoying it.
Helping a lot of leaders. Let's talk about Mount Stupid. I love Mount Stupid. You got beautiful graphs in there. And what do you call the chapter? You're stranded at the summit of Mount Stupid or something like that. What is Mount Stupid?
Mount Stupid is the point where you start to gain experience. It might be knowledge or skill. And your confidence climbs much faster than your competence. And pretty soon you think you know a lot more than you do. And you fall victim to this terrible combination of arrogance and ignorance. And the worst part is that you don't know you're incompetent. Because you just know how much more you know than you did yesterday and how much better you've gotten than you were last month. And you can't see how limited your own expertise is.
One of my favorite graphics in the book, this is skipping way ahead, was the flat Earth diagram that you put toward the end, which is somebody who just discovered that the Earth is flat, and this loop that they kind of do where they discover it, they share it with their friends, they become evangelical preachers about how the Earth is flat and everyone's wrong. Is Mount Stupid kind of related? And I'm not talking about flat earthers versus round earthers, but is that sort of that whole thing? Like, I just discovered something in the I read about anti-vaxxers on the internet or that kind of thing. Can you describe that mindset of what makes, because we just came off a year of unprecedented conspiracy theories, like stuff that if you had gone ahead in 2010 and showed us what we'd be saying in 2020, we'd be like, you're talking about another species or civilization. And yet here we are, and everyone's got their own pet theory about everything now. And that diagram, I want to frame it and put it up somewhere so I can see it. So can you unpack that for us? Because it feels like Mount Stupid.
Yeah, I wouldn't have believed it, honestly, if you had told me in 2010, this is where we would be.
Yeah.
I guess I think about it in terms of an overconfidence cycle, where you start out, I think, if we take the flat earth conspiracy theory as an example, there's actually a bunch of work in psychology on why people get attached to conspiracy theories. And I've seen two really interesting explanations for it. One is what's called the cynical genius illusion, which is the idea that, a lot of times we think cynical people are smarter than their peers. And that's how they show, well, I can't be won over. I'm not gullible.
Right.
On average, they tend to be less intelligent than their peers. And cynicism is a defense mechanism against being outsmarted. This knee jerk, that's not true. And that's how you avoid getting manipulated. The other big motivation, it seems, behind the popularity of conspiracy theories is the desire to believe that a chaotic world is actually in control, that it's predictable, that it's that bad things don't happen at random, right? That good things happen to good people, and I think that this is also part of a lot of religious teachings, right? I don't need to I don't need to tell you that, but the conspiracy theory version of this is, well, I don't want to believe that that a pandemic could just happen. That's horrible. I don't want to live in that kind of world. That is an unjust world. And so let me figure out who the evil people are that orchestrated this in a lab to try to profit from it. And then what happens when you meet a few other people who share that view is you start to take pride in having special knowledge that other people don't have. And you're in the know. And often you're somebody who's been an outsider before. And maybe felt like you weren't respected for your intelligence or you didn't have expertise. And that makes you convinced that you're right. It leads you into a trap of confirmation bias and desirability bias, where you only see what you expect and want to see.
Right.
And then that just kind of reinforces your pride and you become arrogant. And the more you affiliate with a group of people who share that beliefs, the more you end up with a polarized set of views. Because the way people gain status in a group of flat earthers is to be the most extreme flat earther. Right? Like I am more all in on this than anybody else. I know more about why the earth is shaped like a Frisbee than anyone else. And that pushes the whole group a little bit more and more toward the extreme.
Well, logical bullying, I remember I had a counseling session years ago. I was in my 30s and, I had a lot of time in university, et cetera. But I remember my counselor saying that knowledge is power, but I was using it as a defense and as something that I could hold over people. And I've never forgotten that. And you can see that at play, right? That knowledge is actually supposed to be used to serve people and to serve others. Does that resonate?
Yes. I think so many people think that knowledge is a weapon to wield, when in fact it's a resource to share.
Wow. Yep. And so let's talk about, because this goes into like the process, logical bullying, and there's a certain sense in that, even in the flat earther conspiracy, and pick your issue, right? Whatever conspiracy theory you're on, that the virus was manufactured in a lab in China and this happened and that happened. And we figured it all out. And now we know, and the authorities are keeping us from this. And let's talk about echo chambers, which is related to conspiracy theories. So I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Tristan Harris and others like him. Talk about, because I've been writing about that, trying to alert listeners to we all end up in this echo chamber. And I would love for you to speak to people who would say, well, you guys seem so open, but everything's so clear and black and white to me. And I've got this armchair quarterback perspective on the world, and I know what's wrong and you don't. What would you say about echo chambers, and what are the dangers there?
I think the biggest danger of being trapped in an echo chamber is that you spend all your time affirming what you already believe, rather than testing and questioning and evolving your beliefs, which another name for that is learning. I think we all want to be lifelong learners.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, Carey, the way that I've tried to navigate this personally, because I can't write a book like Think Again without worrying that I'm going to be a hypocrite.
Right.
And I've actually shifted my view on this whole idea that you should you should practice what you preach. After writing about some of the risks of thinking too often like a preacher, I thought, well, maybe this should go the other way. That you should only preach things that you already practice.
Oh,
and that way you don't end up with as many moments of.
Oh, that's interesting. I made that shift in my preaching years ago. I'm like, I will only talk about something if it's something I feel I have some level of integration in my life with, or if I'm actively working on it and can speak with integrity about it.
I'm so glad you said the latter part of that, because I think I overcorrected on this one. And I said, all right, if I haven't mastered something, I can't talk about it.
Well, then I got 2 subjects, maybe.
That's one more than me.
On a good day. Maybe 1. Talk to my wife. Okay. So.
No, but it's such a helpful reframe to say, okay, if I'm working on it, then part of the reason that I'm gonna in some cases preach it is the more I say it out loud, the more I'm pushing myself to rethink the habits I'm trying to let go of.
Correct.
So by telling you I have a bad habit of going into prosecutor or logic bully mode, I'm trying to talk myself out of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And complete this rethinking cycle that I've been going through for a number of years. And I guess just thinking out loud about this a little bit, I think that where I've gone with it is I've said, okay, my natural instinct is I like to be right. It bothers me when other people are wrong. So I'm going to follow people on social media. I'm going to listen to the podcasts of people who generally reach the same conclusions I do. And I'm not going to say I was learning nothing doing that, but I was mostly learning more reasons to think the things I already think. And I didn't feel like I was evolving much in my understanding of the world. In some cases, maybe I was going a little deeper, but I was narrowing myself.
Yeah.
And so I shifted my goal a little bit, and I said, okay, let me find people who are people who are both open-minded and high integrity in their thinking and their reasoning. So when they argue in good faith because they're trying to get to the truth, not because they want to troll somebody. And they do take a discovery that they were wrong as, kind of a joyful opportunity for learning. And I want to listen to those people regardless of what conclusions they reach, because those are the kinds of thinkers that I want to learn from. And I think my aha moment was learning is not about the knowledge I accumulate in my head as much as it is the skills that I gain for how to learn. And I want to listen to people who are great learners, not people who always have the right answers.
There is, I don't know whether you're familiar with this phrase at all. It's an obscure interview, but Yuval Noah Harari's work, right? Brilliant. And in so many ways. And there was an interview a couple of years ago, Chris Anderson from TED did with him. And he said, what is the greatest existential threat to humanity? And he said, human hacking. And are you familiar with his work on that? I'm putting you on the spot. Yeah. But my understanding of what he said with human hacking is, to the extent the algorithm is at work and AI is at work, we lose the ability to think for ourselves. We have the illusion that we're thinking again. We have the illusion, but back to that flat earth diagram, right? It's like, I just found, now I'm more of a flat earther than you are. Now I'm more of an anti-vaxxer than you are because you're not even as enlightened as I am. And he says it's that loss of agency and the ability to think independently that is the greatest existential threat to humanity. Any thoughts on that? I'd love your take on that.
Intriguing.
It is. Keeps me up at night some nights.
Me too. It's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I've talked to Tristan Harris about this a bit. And I think this is a great area for me to try to embrace some intellectual humility, because I don't know a whole lot about AI, right? I'm very much a consumer of these ideas, not a producer of them. And I'm glad that Yuval is weighing in, because there's an old joke that it's hard to predict the future, and historians can't even predict the past with perfect accuracy.
Yeah.
And I find it really hard to imagine that I have a crystal ball and have a clear understanding of where artificial intelligence is taking us. But I think one of the things that I've become more open to than I was before is this possibility that, as you described, that AI can create the illusion of free choice. without actually offering it, right? And this goes to the echo chamber point, that if algorithms are engineered to only show me things that I like, and I only like the things that are consistent with what I preach or that are the opposite of what I prosecute, then over time, the algorithms are going to serve me up basically the worst version of my own pre-existing convictions, right? To just drill those into my mind.
You become more extreme.
Yeah, and I think that's a scary proposition. I become more extreme and more entrenched. Both, right? So I'm further down one end of the spectrum, and it's also much harder for me to let go because I built up all this cognitive support and reinforcement for whatever set of opinions I'm attached to.
Which completely jettisons the kind of dialogue we had half an hour ago in this conversation, right? Like that is impossible. That kind of, if I'm entrenched and I'm like, Adam, I'm going to show you how you're wrong and how I'm right, you're out the door. And even if you have to sit there for 30 minutes, you've tuned out.
Completely. And I can see that being a real, I can see that being a source of peril for the human race. What's the timeline for that? I think that it's longer from my read of the data as an outsider than, a lot of people are sounding the alarm about. I don't think that in 5 years, we're going to have computers doing all our thinking for us. What we could have, though, in 5 years is a very subtle set of slippery slopes that we fall down, where we're not seeing how much we're trapping ourselves in one of those echo chambers. And I do think it's a great time to rethink algorithms and ask, is there a way to gauge what a thoughtful conversation looks like? A conversation that opens both people's minds, as opposed to one that just makes everyone feel good.
That's why I think your book is so important. Okay, we're coming up on time. I want to respect your time. I want to ask a question. And this doesn't feel like a place to stop, but I think it's a great place to stop. Probably the most moving part of the book was where you told the story of a Black musician who befriended the leader of the local chapter of the KKK. They became friends, and he actually ultimately resigned his KKK membership. And then also a story out of Quebec, Canada, of an ardent anti-vaxxer who ended up having her mind changed about vaccinations, had her whole family vaccinated. Two very real issues, racism and the whole anti-vaxxer thing. But the tactic used to disarm both in their opposition to it was so surprising. And maybe that is a good place to finish. So what did the vaccine whisperer do? What did, I'm trying to remember his name, was it Daryl?
Daryl Davis.
Yeah. What did he do to disarm the tension between him and a white supremacist?
Well, in both cases, the opening of the other person's mind came from an unusual combination of non-judgmental, asking questions and listening carefully to the answers. And it's the opposite of what any well-trained prosecutor or logic bully would want to do, right?
Let me tell you why racism is wrong. Let me tell you why it's stupid not to get this vaccine for your kids. Yep.
I mean, it's clear as day, right? How could you not see it? You must be an idiot. And what Daryl did was I think the most memorable interaction of all the ones that I learned about from him was the one where he sat down with a KKK member and asked, how did you arrive at this belief? How did you arrive at this belief that Black people are bad or inferior? And this KKK member said, well, look at crime, look at all the Black criminals out there. And, it must be because, Black people they have smaller brains. They have more violent cultures. This is a real problem. And this should not be Daryl Davis's responsibility as a Black man, right? To have to go and educate the hate out of a white supremacist. But Daryl has the courage and the conviction to take it upon himself. And instead of getting angry, which he had the right to do, I think, in that situation, he said, well, I'm Black and I haven't committed any violent crimes. And the KKK member said, well, your gene must be latent. It hasn't come out yet. And I would have lost it at that point, right? I can't even imagine being a Black man and being told that to my face, right? And Daryl let's it sit. And he asked the KKK member to name some serial killers. And he says, every serial killer I can think of is white. I guess that means, maybe you're a serial killer and your gene is latent. It hasn't come out yet. And the guy got very quiet, changed the subject, didn't bring it up for months, and months later, he walked away from the KKK and told Daryl it was that series of questions that changed his mind. And I have to tell you, the big aha I took out of this, and the vaccine whisperer technique is very similar, which is just trying to understand, how did you arrive at these beliefs, and what do they really mean for you? If you want to change what someone believes, you almost always have to start with understanding what they want to believe. Right? Our beliefs are driven by our motivations. And it's a lot harder to force someone to change their beliefs than it is to help them find their own motivation to change. I think the only way you can do that is to ask genuinely open-ended questions about what would lead you. Would you ever consider not hating somebody who looked different from you? Are there circumstances where you might consider getting a vaccine? What would those look like? And then it's that person's job to decide whether they want to change.
Oh, Adam, this has been so rich. I can't thank you enough. Wow. I would love for you to tell people who aren't connected with you online about your podcast, where to find you online. And then obviously, for those of you who are watching, here's the book. The whole thing is devoured, dog-eared, noted, and will be a reread. So I can't recommend it enough. Tell us where we can find you online, Adam.
Oh, thank you, Carey. It really means a lot to me that you you enjoyed the book and that you were willing to recommend it. I guess I would say I host a TED podcast called Work Life, and it's designed to make work better. I have a regular newsletter called Granted, which is about the latest updates on work and psychology that I've found interesting. And I guess I would say that I came into this conversation hoping I would get to rethink some things, and you've definitely accomplished that for me. And I hope also that that we can move toward a world where people recognize that rethinking doesn't mean you always have to change your mind. It just means that you're open to reflecting and reconsidering some of the convictions that might not be serving you well anymore, or that might have made sense in a version of the world that existed 20 or 30 years ago, but that we don't quite live in anymore. And I think that kind of mental flexibility is something that would probably make us all into slightly better leaders and also better partners too.
Much better leaders. I would say one of the things the book has done for me, because I've noticed that age and closed-mindedness are frequent companions, that the older people get, the more cynical they get, and the more closed-minded they get. It's like, oh, I used to believe that when I was younger, but, and as I head into the next, God willing, 20, 30 years, whatever's left, I want to become more open-minded, more curious, because I discover the 80-year-olds that I really admire, they're all those things. And they still have their convictions. They still have their deep core beliefs that perhaps have been with them. But I find that rethinking has made me a stronger Christian, not a weaker believer. That there are some things that needed to go, but then there are some things that are like, wow, I am more core on this than I was because I was open to different points of view. And I think the truth has a way of standing up to scrutiny.
I think that's just beautifully put. And yeah, I mean, worst case scenario, you listen to your critics and they make you stronger. Right?
Well, and you learn from them and you become friends with them, which is a joy.
Something we could all use more of. And Carey, I guess I would say from a recovering faux prosecutor to a former lawyer, current preacher, once upon a time would-be politician, I think that this has been a conversation where I've come away with a bunch of new questions to ask, and that to me is the best thing that could happen in a conversation.
Well, we got to 1/10 of what I wanted to cover, so that gives you an idea of what where my mind is. I feel exactly the same way, Adam. Thank you. This has been a gift, just a pure joy, and a reminder to me why we do this show. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I hope today's episode was helpful to you. You can always get more by subscribing to my channel. I also have a lot more content over at CareyNieuwhof.com for leaders in business and leaders in churches. And you can get transcripts of this episode there and so much more, plus some other stuff I do for leaders. So head on over there to discover more at CareyNieuwhof.com. And in the meantime, I really hope our time together today has helped you lead like never before.